Hey, what's up guys, it's DarkArmedDuelist and today doing a Skull Servant deck profile. So I'm really excited to do this one for you guys because this deck is an amazing 60 card version of Skull Servant that uses That Grass Looks Greener to help us get our monsters in the graveyard. So without further ado, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell there so you can become part of the notification squad, and definitely check out the Patreon down in the description below for all those awesome rewards. Again, your name, description, every single video, getting assigned cards in the mail, and even getting to request a deck profile every single month to your Patreon. So without further ado, let's get straight on into this. So first off, we're going to be playing 3 copies of Skull Servant. This card is an amazing 3-of in the build that's super easy to use in our combos as one of the key cards in the deck. And this card is actually one of the first vanilla monsters ever created in Yu-Gi-Oh! Coming out in Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon. We then play 3 copies of our main boss monster, King of the Skull Servant. King of the Skull Servants is definitely a 3-of in the deck, and it's so easy to summon this deck with cards like White Prince and all sorts of other cards in this build. But this card is amazing because the original attack of this card is the combined number of King of the Skull Servant and Skull Servants in your graveyard times 1,000. And every one of our white monsters and our copies of Skull Servant count as Skull Servant when they're in the graveyard, basically giving this monster a massive amount of attack points so we can go in for game. We then play 3 copies of the Lady in White. This card is definitely a 3-of in the deck, and this card is able to face up level 3 or lower zombie monsters that you control, except this card cannot be destroyed by battle and are unaffected by the effects of spells and traps. And the name of this card is treated as Skull Servant while it's in the graveyard, just like the rest of our white monsters. We then play 3 copies of White Prince. This card is an amazing 3-of and helps you get a bunch of Skull Servants into your graveyard extremely quickly. This card has the ability, if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can send a copy of Skull Servant and a copy of Lady in White directly from your deck to the graveyard, basically getting you 3 monsters in your graveyard for the price of 1, which is absolutely insane. You can even send them from your hand, which is absolutely insane to be able to do directly from your hand or deck to the graveyard when this card touches the graveyard, which is absolutely crazy. You can also banish 2 Skull Servants and this card in the graveyard to special summon King of the Skull Servants directly from your deck, instantly getting our boss monster out on our side of the field. We then play 3 copies of White Lord. White Lord is insane. This card is so powerful in the deck and has the ability, this card's name becomes Skull Servant while it's in the graveyard, and also this card has the ability that if you have a Skull Servant or King of the Skull Servant in the graveyard, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard and then send cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard up to the number of Skull Servant and King of the Skull Servants in your graveyard, which is an insane effect to get you so many different cards in the graveyard. And it's so cool to be able to mill like 9 cards off this card's effect, and it's absolutely crazy to be able to do because you're just going to fill up the graveyard with more Skull Servants to make your copy of King get absolutely massive. This card also has the ability you can banish this card in the graveyard and then target a Skull Servant or King of the Skull Servant in the graveyard and special summon it to your side of the field, which is an amazing effect to be able to do to instantly get King of the Skull Servant back on your side of the field if you mill it to the graveyard off your copy of White Lord. We then play 3 copies of White Baking. White Baking is so good in this deck. This card has the ability to become Skull Servant while in the graveyard, and if a level 3 or lower zombie monster you control would be destroyed by battle of a card effect, you can discard this card instead. And if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add 2 monsters with different names from your deck to your hand, except another copy of this card, that are either Skull Servant or specifically Skull Servant in their text, then discard a card. Meaning you can instantly add your copy of White Prince from your deck to your hand and King of the Skull Servant, which is an amazing effect because then you can send your copy of White Prince to the graveyard off of White Baking's effect, and then send your copy of Lady in White and the original Skull Servant to the graveyard, getting you a bunch of Skull Servants in the graveyard off your copy of White Baking, which is absolutely insane. Just get you a bunch of monsters in the graveyard so you can summon out King of the Skull Servant. Absolutely amazing to be able to summon out to your side of the field because it's going to come out massive when you use this combo. We then play 3 copies of White Princess. White Princess is basically a walking foolish barrel for the deck for your copy of White Prince, because this card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard, and if this card is normal or special summon, you can send a White Prince from your deck to the grave, which is an awesome effect to instantly get this card in the graveyard, so we can summon out our copy of King and get it massive to be able to send our copy of Lady and our copy of Skull Servant to the graveyard off the Lady or your copy of White Prince. So this card basically sends 3 Skull Servants to the graveyard when it's summoned to your side of the field, which is insane. We then play 2 copies of White Mare. White Mare is just a good 2-of in the deck for this 60 card build, as this card has the ability to become Skull Servant while in the graveyard, and also you can discard this card to activate one of the following effects to either target a banished Skull Servant or White Prince or White Mare and return it back to the graveyard, or target one of your banished Lady in White or King of the Skull Servants and special summon it, which is an awesome effect to instantly bring back your copy of King of the Skull Servant or return one of your other cards to the graveyard. So that's it for the Skull Servant monsters. Let's get into the other tech zombie monsters and other tech monsters we're playing in this deck. So for the other tech monsters, we're playing 3 copies of Imseti. The Horus engine is the best engine to play in any zombie deck to help you summon out the zombie vampire, and Imseti is the best one, so we're going to be playing this card as a 3-of. All of your Horus monsters share a common effect that if you have King Sarcophagus on your side of the field, you can special summon them from the graveyard, but the reason Imseti is so important in this deck is you can send this card and another card from your hand to the graveyard to be able to add a copy of King Sarcophagus directly from your deck to your hand and then draw a card, which is an awesome effect to be able to use so we can summon out our copy of the zombie vampire to mill 4 cards off the top of both players' decks, helping us get a bunch of cards into the graveyard. And this card also helps us get our Skull Servant monsters in the graveyard by sending itself and another copy of a card in our hand to the graveyard, so we can basically get a Skull Servant monster in the grave and get our copy of King Sarcophagus and get a draw. We then play a single copy of Happy. Happy is just a really good name to be able to play in the deck, to be able to summon out to our side of the field so we can go in for rank 8 plays. We play a single copy of Blessings of Horus. This card gains 1200 attack points for every single Horus monster on your side of the field. So in this build, this card can go up to 4800 because we play all 4 Horus names in this deck. And this card is amazing in the build just to give us another level 8 monster we can summon to our side of the field to go in for more rank 8 plays. We then play a single copy of Protection of Horus. I like to play all 4 of the Horus names in this build, so we can basically just send them to the graveyard off King Sarcophagus and constantly have a name we can bring back to our side of the field to go in for our rank 8 plays. But these are really good in the deck and the best engine to be able to play in just about any zombie deck to be able to go in for your copy of the zombie vampire so you can mill your cards to the graveyard. We then play 2 copies of Gozuki. Gozuki is great in this deck as a 2-of because during your main phase, you can actually send a zombie monster from your deck to the graveyard, and if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can actually banish a zombie monster in the grave, accept a copy of Gozuki to special summon a zombie monster in the hand, which is a really cool effect. This card is basically just a walking Foolish Sparrow, which is why I played as a 2-of in the deck. We then play 3 copies of Mizuki. Mizuki is really good in this build as a 3-of because we're constantly milling cards to the graveyard, and you can just banish this card from the grave to be able to bring back one of your zombie monsters to your side of the field like King of the Skull Servants. So that's it for the monsters, guys. Let's get into the spells. So for the spells, we're going to start with a single copy of Terraforming. Terraforming is an extremely important 1-of because we actually do play a field spell in this deck. We then play a single copy of Foolish Burial. Foolish Burial is amazing in this build to help us get the exact monster we need in the graveyard. We then play a single copy of Monster Reborn so we can bring back our copy of King of the Skull Servant to our side of the field. We then play a single copy of 1-for-1 because this card can also help us bring out our copy of King of the Skull Servant directly from our deck. We then play a single copy of Called by the Grave. Called by the Grave is really good to stop your opponent's hand traps while you're going in for all of your plays. We then play a single copy of a Card Destruction. Card Destruction is insane in this deck to help us get our monsters in the graveyard and maybe even mess up our opponent's strategy by helping them discard their entire hand. We then play a single copy of That Grass Looks Greener. That Grass is the reason we actually are playing a 60 card build for this deck, as this card is insane because the average player usually plays a 40 card deck, but this card is a 60 card deck, and this card has the ability, if you have more cards in your deck than your opponent does, send cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard so that you have the same number of cards in your deck as your opponent, meaning if we have a 60 card deck and our opponent has a 40 card deck, then we'll be able to send cards to the graveyard, say the top 20 cards, which is the difference between them, which is absolutely crazy to be able to do, just to get a bunch of monsters in the graveyard to make our copy of King of the Skull Servant absolutely massive. We then play 2 copies of Triple Tactics Talent. Triple Tactics Talent is an amazing 2-of in the build to either let us draw 2 cards, take control of an opponent's monster, or we can actually look at our opponent's hand and just automatically deal with a hand trap by shuffling a card from our opponent's hand back into the deck. We then play 2 copies of Burial from a Different Dimension. Burial from a Different Dimension is really important in this deck as a 2-of because you can use this card to be able to work with your copy of White Prince, because White Prince will banish itself plus 2 Skull Servant monsters from the graveyard to summon your copy of King of the Skull Servant directly from the deck. So you basically just activate this card to kind of sort of be like an E-Telly for the deck, because it's just going to put the 3 monsters back into the graveyard, which is really cool to help you get your Skull Servants back in the graveyard to give your copy of King a little bit of a boost. We then play 3 copies of Triple Tactics Thrust. Triple Tactics Thrust is an amazing 3-of in the deck. This card is used to actually search out That Grass Looks Greener, or any of our basically 1-of spell cards in the deck. And this card is absolutely crazy, as if your opponent has activated a monster effect during this turn, you can set a normal spell or trap directly from your deck, except another copy of this card. Or if your opponent controls a monster, you can add it to your hand instead, which is an amazing effect in this deck to basically just instantly get to your copy of Grass, so you can send a bunch of cards off the top of your deck to the graveyard so we can go in for game. We then play 3 copies of Allure of Darkness. We play so many different darks in this deck, so this card is an amazing 3-of in the build, just to help us dig into the deck for the exact cards that we need. We then also play 3 copies of King Sarcophagus. King Sarcophagus is an extremely important 3-of in the deck to help us get our copies of our horse monsters into the graveyard, because up to 4 times per turn, you can send a card from your hand to the graveyard to send a horse monster from your deck to the graveyard, which is an awesome effect to instantly get a horse name into the graveyard. You can just bring it back to your side of the field. We then play 3 copies of Walls of the Imperial Tomb. Walls of the Imperial Tomb is amazing in the deck as a 3-of because you can actually search this card off your copy of Terraforming, but this card instantly searches out your copy of Imseti from your deck to your hand, and this card's name becomes King Sarcophagus while on the field. Also, during your main phase, you can add a copy of a horse monster from your deck to your hand, then place a card from your hand on the bottom of the deck, instantly getting to the exact card you need, like a copy of Imseti, so you can search out your copy of your King Sarcophagus so you can go in for your plays. We then also play 3 copies of Forbidden Droplets. Droplets is just really good in this deck as a 3-of to basically just turn your opponent's field off and half the attack points of your opponent's monsters so you can swing in with King of the Skull Servants and go in for game. So that's it for the main deck, guys. Let's get into the extra deck. So for the extra deck, we're going to start off with the Zombie Vampire. Zombie Vampire is a definite 1 in the deck, especially since we're playing the Horus engine in the deck, to be able to send our cards from our deck to the graveyard, which is just going to help you get 4 more cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard, and 4 cards from the top of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. Then we get to bring back a monster among those 8 cards to our side of the field, which is amazing, which could be a King of the Skull Servant. We can also mill cards to the graveyard like White Prince, so we can get a bunch more cards in the graveyard, which is amazing. We then play a single copy of Garunix Eternity. Garunix Eternity is so easy to go into, and you can actually summon this card out to your side of the field to clear the way so you can normal summon out your copy of King of the Skull Servant and go in for game. As if this card is XZ summon, you destroy all other monsters on the field. You can also detach a material in this card to actually target a spell or trap on the field and destroy it. If you do, this card gains 500 attack points. So this card is an amazing option to summon out to your side of the field just to board wipe your opponent, normal summon out King, and go in for game. We then play a single copy of number 38. Number 38 is great just in case you need to summon this card out as a spell negate. 1 copy of number 90. Number 90 is really good in the deck as a 1-of just to summon out as a monster negate. With my single copy of Coach King. Coach King is really good in this deck because it helps you draw 3 cards and also do 800 points of burn damage for every monster that you draw off this card's effect. And you use that effect up to thrice per turn to draw a card and then inflict 800 points of damage to your opponent if it's a monster. We then play a single copy of Typhon. Typhon's just a good option just in case you go second and you need to summon this card out to your side of the field. And it's just an awesome card to be able to make in the deck. With my single copy of Zeus. Zeus is a great board wipe in this build just to summon out to your side of the field and board wipe all the monsters on the field. We then play a single copy of Underworld Goddess. It's actually very easy in the deck to be able to swarm the field in this deck, especially with the Horus monsters. So you can basically link away all 4 Horus monsters on your side of the field and 1 really big monster on your opponent's side of the field. It could be a towers-like boss monster that you need to outwit this card. We then play a single copy of Access Code. Access Code's amazing in this deck to be able to summon out and just pop multiple cards on the field, and it comes out absolutely massive. We then play a single copy of Selene because Imseti is a spellcaster. We can actually use this card to link climb into our copy of Access Code, and with cards like the Zombie Vampire and our copies of Grass, it's very easy to get a bunch of spells in the graveyard, so you can link climb into your Access Code. We play a single copy of Pentastag. Pentastag is really good because it gives the monster that points to piercing damage, which is always going to be King of the Skull Servant. So summon your copy of King of the Skull Servant under an extra monster zone, so you can summon out this card and go in for piercing damage. We play a single copy of SP Little Knight. SP Little Knight could be changed out in this deck very easily for a copy of Nightmare Unicorn, so you can basically just spin cards off the field, but this card is a double interruption, so if you have it, play it. We then play a single copy of IP. IP is really good to go over your copy of SP during your opponent's turn. Play a single copy of Linkribo, because at the end of the day, we are playing a vanilla monster, which is our copy of Skull Servant. So you can summon this card out to your side of the field using a copy of Skull Servant, and on the off chance of this 60 card deck that you draw 2 copies of Skull Servant in your opening hand, which is very rare in this deck, you can normal summon out your copy of Skull Servant, link it away, summon out the second copy off this, and then link climb into something else, which is absolutely insane that you can do that. Or you can use the second copy of Skull Servant that you do summon out to summon out a copy of Relinquished Anima, which can gobble up an opponent's monster. So that's it for the deck, guys. I hope you enjoyed. This deck is super fun to be able to play. If you guys have never played a 60 card version of Skull Servant, you should definitely give this deck a try. And it's such a fun deck to be able to play, because you can summon out so many different copies of King of the Skull Servant in this deck. I very easily, in this build, summoned out all 3 in a single turn to go in for like 40,000 damage, which is absolutely insane to be able to do. And it's such a fun OTK deck to play, especially since it's based on one of the first vanilla monsters ever made, and actually one of the weakest ones in terms of attack and defense. So that's going to be this one, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell there so you can become part of the notification squad, and we'll see you guys in the next video. See you later, guys.